Well, thanks so much for inviting me to talk here. Love to see what you guys are doing in Morris. Just fascinating, all the projects you have going on there, and also just appreciate the interest in how the grid works. This is part of just what we do. So I work for the Department of Commerce, and we protect public interest in your daily activities every day, whether you're filling your gas tank or turning on the lights. You'll probably find that Commerce has a role and a little sticker on it. And part of what we do is actually to maintain the state's emergency energy planning and recovery plans, not on the front lines like the utilities do, but more in the, well, what would happen if longer term planning, and also just some of that near term coordination when something does go wrong. So Chris Watkins said he was going camping on a soggy camping trip last weekend, and so I just had to throw that in there. There's no bad weather, just bad gear stuff, Scandinavians say. And I guess that goes for system reliability too. And when stuff, like every polar vortex that seems to come along, especially when Texas shows what happens when you don't plan for the cold, we can just shake our heads. But we know that when we can put a person on the moon, build wind farms that work in cold climates, and even offshore, wind works just fine when designed correctly. And let's quote another one: "A chance favors the prepared mind." We know it gets cold here. Extreme weather, though, will challenge system design limits and assumptions. And all parts of the US have experienced power grid challenges from cold weather in the past decade. It's interesting to go back when and think through what happened in each one, but the Midwest has almost been kind of like boringly safe as in terms of the grid. Our grid's pretty solid. And there's a couple reasons why, and I'll talk about that in a bit here. We just know in Minnesota, cold weather is a given, and our utilities know that. They know that cold is no joke. They don't want you without power in the middle of winter when it's super duper cold. And emergencies never happen just because of one thing. It's usually a combination of unexpected events or a 1-2 punch that causes problems. We pretty much know how to deal with cold, even when it gets to -58, which they plan for. So we appreciate that those utilities are there for us, keeping the power on. Today, I just want to highlight 3 reports that we've done recently that can shed light on some of the sustainability efforts that the Morris community is thinking through, help understand our trends and factors behind the rapid pace of transformation in Minnesota's power sector to date and projections through 2034 based on what utilities, preferred plans are in their resource plans. Talk a little bit about the Minnesota Solar Pathways Project, which is one that we had. It was a 3-year project, and Otter Tail helped us with that one as well. We looked in some of the least risk, best value strategies for meeting Minnesota's 10% solar goal by 2030. And then the Minnesota Thermal Grid Study, we haven't really publicized this one a lot. We published it in 2013. But we were looking at cost-effective, efficient heating, because we know, again, it's cold here. We use a lot of energy for heat. And how could we make that less carbon intense? Well, district energy actually turns out to be a great, it's not super new, but it's a great resource. Can take any type of heat source. It's really more about how you distribute it. And it can support resilience and load flexibility. So here's the quad report. If you can get past the boring cover page, there's a lot in there. And I wanted today just focus mostly on the power sector transition stuff. Chris mentioned a few stats that we also have in here through 2020. So 2020, compared to 2005, which we always benchmark against for our state decarbonization goals, it's quite a bit of change. We've more than cut coal as of last year, more than half, and renewables are now the leading source of power as of last year. Now the question is, last year was an unusual year to say the least. Will that trend continue? Well, we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So we touched on that a bit. Wind is the most. of the renewables, but and then as far as our state decarbonization goals through 2018, so you can see that we've had great progress in electric generation. Transportation is decarbonizing, but more slowly. And our buildings are still actually increasing despite the success of SIP, despite the utilities meeting their efficiency and conservation goals. The emissions from buildings are going up, and that's mostly from use of natural gas. Whereas our carbon intensity of the grid is dropping remarkably. And so this chart here is only through 2019, but I have seen some data in the Minnesota Energy Fact Sheet from Bloomberg New Energy Finance. They show that we've actually dropped below the US average now for carbon intensity of the grid. And so we're on a trajectory to even decarbonize further. And so that to policymakers says, it's time to lean into that and look for other ways to decarbonize through our electric sector, because that seems to be the smoothest path to decarbonization. So our electric utilities, where if you go back and look at, so if you combine renewables and nuclear, we're 55% carbon free as of 2020. So 55% compared to the next 15 years are based on the resource plans for the 3 investor-owned utilities, which are the ones shown in green here. And I realize I have the mouse on the wrong screen. And Great River Energy. So if you look at those for utilities that serve a lot of the load in the state, it's about 70% of the load. They are planning for a transition to a system that's nearly 70% carbon-free by 2034. So we'll have a lot more wind, and we'll have a lot more solar. We'll still have nuclear through 2034. After that, that's a policy decision that's coming up. And so these are the utilities that represent about 80%, 86% of Minnesota's load, represented by these 5 utilities who are all making commitments to reduce carbon emissions. So about the solar, 10% solar in the state's a lot of solar. It's a lot of land. And so I want to talk a little bit about the Minnesota Solar Pathways Project. It was a DOE-funded $2 million grant from the U.S. Department of Energy Solar Energy Technologies Office to look at least risk, best value strategies to meet our state's goals. And we really looked at, what are some near-term, no regrets, how do we do this kind of stuff? Also, how much is it going to cost? And what are different ways to make it cost less? So I love that every time we have a polar vortex or a heat wave, people ask, how does the grid work? Grid is amazing. It's a completely connected system all the way from Nebraska out to Maine, Florida up to Manitoba. We're just a small slice of that. And that provides a huge value, that we're not just a small island, but we can balance the grid with our neighbors. That is a huge help, and it's a big part of our stability. Part of the Solar Pathways project looked at what would it take for Minnesota actually not just to get to 10% solar, but what about going to 70% solar and wind by 2030, or maybe even 100%? So we first modeled that question on just the state level. If you were to treat Minnesota like an island, what would that take? And the team rightly said, well, we're not an island. So let's look at how this works compared to the MISO region as a whole. And so what we found was that 100% wind and solar can be achieved at a cost comparable to wholesale costs. And 95% wind and solar are possible at even or maybe even lower cost. But it doesn't, on a cost basis, necessarily make sense to overbuild or to build solar and wind just to match the load and then store that with battery storage, but rather to overbuild it. And that extra capacity can be really interesting. As you know, in Morris, when you have extra capacity, perhaps you could turn that into ammonia. When you have all this extra free energy, essentially, I mean, it's not free to install it, but once it's there, the marginal cost to produce it is free. What would you do with that? Every time we've had a low cost power source, people have figured that out, what to do with that. It is an exciting proposition. So, and you can see the market ready generation already in the queue at MISO. And it's rather interesting, actually, within the time frame of this project from 2017 to 2020, you've seen that market ready solar is now starting to dominate the MISO queue. So the solar is there in yellow, wind is green, blue is gas, red and orange are storage and hybrid storage. It's mostly renewables in the queue just waiting to interconnect if we can just improve the grid capacity to connect. Now, also interesting is just that in Minnesota is about half solar and half wind because we have great wind resources in this area. In the rest of the MISO region, which you can kind of see here, it's mostly solar. So that's market ready. That's just that the technology and the markets have all kind of, and the policies have all kind of combined in just sort of a way that this is all just there, ready to go. So other things that have come out of this project are the Minnesota Solar Guide. This is on the Clean Energy Resource Team's website to help with siting. So a big part of moving ahead with solar is really where you put it all. And making sure communities have a say in how land gets used. If they had plans for expansion of their community, development, or if a landowner just decides that farming isn't as good on a particular piece of land and the lease costs for solar actually look a little more attractive on some of their less productive farmland. This is a sort of what's going to be our next challenge is balancing landowner interests who want to choose between farming or maybe diversifying with energy development and communities who want to choose how to develop. And this is a resource to help sort through all that. And so this whole project is, and the modeling and interactive models are all on the minnesotasolarpathways.org site. And next, I'd just like to go over the thermal grid the thermal grid study. Basically just, and I realize we're getting short on time here and a little bit over, but basically in Minnesota, more than half of the energy, the total energy we use for everything from our cars to heating our buildings, over half of that goes as waste heat. And a lot of that is just because of the physical limits of producing energy through a thermal generator. And some of that is insulation in our buildings. And some of that is just the power conversion from traditional combustion engines in our transportation system. There's quite a lot of waste in our traditional ways of using energy. What if, I mean, it's a cold place, what if we were to harness more of that energy? If you look at this, I was just kind of thrilled to see this is also available as a carbon flow chart. So I'm not going to dwell on that a bit, but I'm sure the slides will be available after to see really what's driving our carbon emissions. But the main idea is that buildings consume over 40% of the energy used in Minnesota. And despite some really genuine efforts to drive efficiency and conservation, our policies aren't getting us there to reduce carbon in our buildings. So again, thermal grids are a cost-effective way. If it's difficult, it may be difficult to plan, but Morris happens to have a nice combination of existing thermal grids through the college campus. And what we found when we did the study, Morris kind of rose to the top of having existing thermal grids, having existing industrial waste heat from food processors, from water treatment, and a thermal grid can serve as a heat sink for excess wind power, geothermal, industrial waste heat, whatever you got. You can put it into a thermal grid and it can support load flexibility and resilience. So something to consider. And we can provide the links to those reports. And just a word about conservation and efficiency. I mean, it is really the least cost thing, and it supports resiliency, because if your power does go out, you're going to be happy that you've added some insulation and weather sealing. And it also provides $3.75 in benefits to society for each dollar spent in SIP. And this year, just a week ago, the legislature passed the ECO Act, which expands SIP so that we go from 1.5% energy efficiency goals to 2.5%, and expands the options for utilities to plan for to include more demand response, because as we move towards a more variable generation grid, we're going to need more options to adapt and absorb the peaks in load and reduce when we have less generation available. So another just word about the things like you are doing for planning on sustainability in your community. We do have a whole chapter focused on communities actively implementing climate and energy goals. The communities have made tremendous efforts over the past 4 years, and that's reflected in that report from the Quad report. So again, you know, what we do is just paraphrase from, you know, Milton Friedman has said it well. You know, we plan for things that could go wrong so that we have plans available if something that seemed impossible suddenly becomes inevitable. We have intelligent plans to go to. And maybe also to paraphrase from Game of Thrones, you know, we know things and we plan, and mostly what we know is that it gets cold here. So, and we appreciate all the planning that the regional grid operators and the utilities do. So with that, I don't know if we have time for questions, but that's it for me.